what a civilization is a meshwork of institutions, functioning and non-functioning, that are working together in an ecosystem. Is that about right?
Yes, an interdependent ecosystem of institutions. It seems to me that no matter what type of organization you look at, the truly exemplars of that class, right, of that set, are going to radically outperform their peers, right? You're going to have companies that are worth 10 times as much as their competitors. You're going to have armies that are, beat enemies at like 5-to-1 ratios. You're going to have religions that have hundreds of millions of people versus cults that fizzle out with a few hundred followers.
Yeah.
Really distinct outcomes for things that nominally on paper are pretty similar.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because often I think you have sort of these originals that are breakthroughs, and then you have bad copies, like photocopies, right?
Yeah.
So you can have a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy that's very degraded. It's still like if you list out on paper what it has, it like looks like a great institution. In practice, it just doesn't fit together in the details, because the people who are trying to build it are following a stereotype. They're following a recipe, a cookbook, and over time, that cookbook necessarily degrades, mistakes creep in, but also circumstances change. Things might become obsolete.
Mm.
And if I can liken a civilization to a forest, a forest doesn't die with the death of a particular tree, no matter how ancient. But a forest does die, or could be said to die, once after the old trees die, new ones don't grow. So when it comes to civilizations, they seem to have a lifespan where some of these mutually interdependent institutions phase out. They can be replaced by others. But in Eurasian history, there are like 12 identifiable dark ages, right? Times when it's very clear that the population went down, the technology regressed, that a particular society wasn't just transformed for the better, but actually notably became worse in very tangible ways. The usual examples people give of this is sort of the fall of the Roman Empire, but we could list things like the late Bronze Age collapse around 1000 BC, where, say, literacy was lost in what would later become Greece, right? That's the boundary between, say, the Mycenaeans and the classical Greeks. Or say, the collapse of Indian civilization, with cities like Mohenjo-daro also vanishing many, many thousands of years ago.
So what's going on in those civilizations that leads to a collapse? Are there any commonalities?
Well, the theory of why civilizations fail, right? This has been, again, also very theorized on, because unless you sort of have an excessively optimistic read of human history, it does seem, regardless of what you think about as progress, that there are significant steps back. And occasionally, every now and then, people try to strenuously argue that, the Dark Ages weren't that dark. And that's kind of true, but still, the classical world did vanish, and much was lost when it vanished.
Right.
So even if the later periods of the Middle Ages are not as dark as once defamed, the early Middle Ages, in fact, see a massive drop in population, dropping living standards. But it is true that some of that happens in the very late stages of the Roman Empire as well. So the decline doesn't start when barbarians burn down the cities. It's the social transformation that leads to a situation where the barbarians can burn down the cities. Excessive extraction by the ruling class to sustain itself at the expense of long-term fundamentals. So excessive material extraction of an existing base. In the case of the Roman Empire, they couldn't conquer any new wealthy lands. So they, over time, more and more turned towards taxing what they already had and exhausting it, not just financially, but demographically even, having to eventually rely on mercenaries rather than their own citizens to support the military and security needs of the Roman Empire. So that's one, excessive extraction of elites. Why does this happen? It happens basically because, in a way, all empires are Ponzi schemes. They work great until they stop growing. Once they stop growing, they hit severe problems of political economy. Basically, the coordination of elites is often sort of predicated on there being positive sum games, right? Like, Pompey and Caesar, to use a Roman example, can work together quite effectively while there's enough glory and power to go around. But once there's less power to go around, once it's become very concentrated, once they've sort of defeated all their political foes, the triumvirate breaks up, especially after the death of Crassus. So you can have a situation where the elites turn to excessive extraction and inter-elite conflict comes to dominate a society. And if we look at this at a societal level, not at the elite level, it very much looks like a society that has started digesting itself. And this can be a slow process. Like, the correct way to think of the last century or two of, say, the Roman Empire isn't that there is a sudden crash and everything goes bad, but imagine GDP shrinks by 1% every year for 100 years. What you have at the end of that century, that sort of slow decay of wealth and so on, is profoundly different than what you had at the start. Even if any single year, the changes are so small as to be imperceptible. So it's a descent down a gradient. And then this thinning of societal reserves leaves you open to external shocks. And then when an external shock hits, your society, instead of responding back with vitality, collapses, crumbles on the spot. I think something very clearly similar is happening with the late Bronze Age collapse. I think it happened with the end of the Han Dynasty in ancient China. And I think it's a sort of almost a universal pattern